Nintendo's Game Boy line of portable systems ran from 1989 to 2010 in North America. Most were the preferred portable systems during their respective runs. They provided quality gaming that proved to stand the test of time. But these times were changing. 3D graphics had been a staple in the home console market, rarely making an appearance on Nintendo's portable consoles. But that was about to change. A third pillar would become a major supporting beam. With a touch and inspiration from the past, this was the future. And the future was now. After a year of the Game Boy Advance SP being on the shelf, Nintendo launched what they called a third pillar to their gaming consoles. They named it the DS. It took the design of the GBA SP and improved upon it. The clamshell design was present, along with the rechargeable battery. It also included a dedicated standalone headphone jack and a sleep mode. This new handheld also innovated with a throwback. Design elements were taken from the first Nintendo portables. These elements were revised and innovated to accommodate the modern world. 2 screens were added, one on each half of the console. One of them is a touchscreen, which was revolutionary for the time. The stylus was also added into the console so screen presses could be deliberate and precise. A GBA slot was also included on the bottom of the system that allowed only Game Boy Advance games to be played on it. But that did make it backwards compatible, which helped it appeal to Game Boy owners. Nintendo explained that it would be a complementary console next to the Game Boy Advance and GameCube. But we knew what they were doing. This was the next phase for their handhelds. It made no sense keeping both the DS and the Game Boy Advance when this played both libraries of games. This essentially made the Game Boy Advance part of the DS. People really only needed to buy the DS to play all the current games. Unfortunately, this meant that the long-standing tradition of having the current handheld system backwards compatible with all Game Boy games was now over, which really was a loss for people who like to play them. The console design is chunky with many angles. It more resembles a toy rather than a sophisticated piece of technology. But that didn't matter. The tech this portable had was so advanced, it made the Game Boy Advance look like a relic of the past. Nintendo knew that they needed to blow us away with their DS games. What better game to demonstrate how great this new system was than by making the legendary Mario 64 a launch title for it? This was amazing. 3D games on a portable system was astonishing. Nintendo really likes to design and improve their successful consoles. The DS was mega successful, so it got 4 revisions. The first DS console that was treated to a revision is called the DS Lite. This design improved pretty much everything about the original DS without compromising anything about it. The DS Lite is a sleek, compact handheld as opposed to the chunky, angle-ridden original. The buttons feel much better, as if they have more travel, which felt more like a home console controller. It also retained the Game Boy Advance slot on the bottom, which is kept safe with a nice cap. But the biggest improvement that they made to this console were the 2 screens. They made them backlit. They look very similar to the GBA SP101 screen. The colors look so vivid, and the image looks so much sharper. Not only that, but they also implemented 4 levels of brightness. This was great for playing in direct sunlight and also playing in the dark. Additionally, you could ration the battery life by turning down the screen's brightness. This console revision was one of the very best ever done by anyone. You could tell that everything was meticulously crafted and designed to be the most optimal it could be for the time. However, there is one thing that hinders the DS Lite. It's not a big issue. In fact, it's not an issue at all, because you can still play it just fine. When you play Game Boy Advance games, the game cartridge sticks out at the bottom, which again isn't really a problem, just an eyesore. It almost looks as ridiculous as the Game Boy Advance SP does when original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games are played on it. Everything else on the DS Lite sits flush with the console shell, including the triggers, switches, and stylus. But I'm okay with the compromise. The DS Lite is a vast improvement over its predecessor. The third iteration of the DS came almost 3 years later. This model was given the name DSi. It's roughly the same size as the DS Lite and has similar screens, which are slightly bigger. However, it did change up quite a bit from the previous model. It now features 2 cameras, one inward and one outward facing. The DSi added connectivity to the internet that allowed for downloads from the DSi shop. It was also compatible with certain games that were only playable on the DSi. You could also use SD cards to expand the system's storage, which was a great addition. However, there's one glaring omission on the console that really takes a step back. They removed the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, which was a giant negative for the console. This updated model only plays DS games. This was a big deal for many people, but Nintendo wasn't finished tinkering with the DS just yet. The fourth and final version of the DS came out just a year after the release of the DSi. This new version was bigger, and that's really the only difference between it and the DSi. They cleverly named it the DSi XL. Fitting for what it is. The bigger screens and longer battery life were some of the few draws that enticed people to buy it. Many claim that this is the definitive DS experience, saying the larger screens and more room to grip the console made it a more comfortable console to play. The next phase of Nintendo handheld systems wouldn't stray too far from the previous generation, even keeping the DS name, but added the number 3 to the beginning of it. It retained the clamshell design that worked so well for the Game Boy Advance SP and the DS family of systems. That design became synonymous with Nintendo. It added the circle pad, which functions surprisingly well as an analog stick. The top screen was also changed to a widescreen. It could also connect to the internet and download apps and games. It included a virtual console that allowed users to download classic games from Nintendo and Sega, including the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Sega Game Gear, and the NES. Early adopters were given 10 Game Boy Advance games and 10 NES games through their Ambassador program. The NES games were eventually available on the Virtual Console for individual purchase, while the GBA games were never available to anyone outside the Ambassador program. But the biggest and most prominent addition was the stereoscopic glasses-free 3D. This was such an amazing feat. Keep in mind that this came out during the 3D craze of the early 2010s. All the movies at the time were being made in 3D, and 3D TVs were selling at all the major retailers, although those TVs required special glasses to experience the 3D. This new system didn't require glasses and really did display 3D. It really is quite amazing. The 3DS wasn't initially received very well. It required that you keep your head still in a very specific spot. If your head wavered out of that specific spot, the image turns into 2, blurring the gameplay and making it difficult to play. If you didn't like the 3D effect, Nintendo added a slider that decreased the amount of 3D that is displayed. The slider also turns the 3D off altogether. This original model is sleek and modern. It has a premium feel that wouldn't return on future models. It's also backwards compatible with DS games. Nintendo took a look at the DSi XL and decided to implement the same design into the 3DS. They increased the size of the console and screens. They also redesigned a few of the buttons that made them feel a little bit better. The console was also redesigned so that the bottom screen didn't leave marks on the top screen after being closed. However, the screens remained the same, but bigger. The 3D effect still suffered from the small area your head had to be in to experience the 3D properly. This was a major setback for people. The one thing that needed to be fixed remained the same. Though this model did improve the form factor and button placement, it looked and felt less premium than the original model. With 2 models on the market, it was surprising Nintendo put out another one. This new model was marketed as a more kid-friendly version. It omitted the clamshell design and went with a solid form factor, calling back to the original Game Boy Advance, which was the last Nintendo portable to feature a non-closable design. The shape is much more round than other models. It has a wedge design as well. It also omitted the 3D effect. This console was aptly named the 2DS. Initially it wasn't well received, but some have gone on to call it the best 3DS model. But this wasn't the end for the 3DS's legacy. It would go on to be further revised and crafted. In 2015, 2 new models were released. The new consoles were given the name New, which spiraled the 3DS console names into confusion. The new 3DS and new 3DS XL perfected the 3DS console. The biggest improvement came with the 3D effect. Both systems have face tracking that keeps the 3D in focus. This is what the 3DS should have been when it initially released. This was the vision. The 3D is excellent and much more tolerable compared to the earlier models. Other things were redesigned, like the start and select buttons, 2 more shoulder buttons, the C-stick, and a faster processor. Super Nintendo games were also added to the Virtual Console, but they were only playable on the new systems. The smaller model also featured swappable faceplates, letting owners customize their consoles however they like. The final model of the 3DS would come with a redesigned 2DS. In 2017, Nintendo released the new 2DS XL. This model features all the upgrades the new 3DS and new 3DS XL have, but without the 3D. This is a 2DS, only playing games in 2D. The shell was also redesigned with a matte finish and a top screen that looks more like a smartphone. The game slot is now on the bottom, and the stylus is also significantly shorter. This would be the final model in the 3DS family of systems. The DS line of handhelds revolutionized portable gaming, introducing touch features and real 3D effects. This third pillar would become a major supporting beam for Nintendo. With the touch and inspiration from the past, this was the future. The DS and 3DS handhelds wrote that future, and that future was now.